In our world, everything made by human hands, cars, locomotives, planes and ships have their own service life, and when this time expires they are sent for scrap, and there are many cemeteries of abandoned equipment, which for various reasons has not yet seen a second life in foundries' metallurgical plants. In this video we'll look at the largest cemeteries of abandoned vehicles and equipment. The ship graveyard in Mauritania is a mysterious and fascinating place. Here, old ships are scattered along the entire coast for several kilometers. On the Ras Nouadhibou Peninsula, which stretches along the west coast of Africa and separates Mauritania and northern Sahara, there is a town called Nouadhibou with a population of about 100,000 people. It is the second largest city in Mauritania and the economic capital of the region. However, it is better known in the world as the largest ship graveyard. The entire sandy coast is strewn with huge ships that have served their purpose, which began to accumulate here in the 80s of the last century. The reason that created this situation was the fact that Mauritanian port officers, in exchange for bribes, allowed out-of-service ships to be left in the harbor and around the bay. Disposal of an old ship is quite an expensive undertaking, so the port authorities, for a moderate fee, allowed shipping companies to illegally transport and leave old ships in the bay from various parts of the world. This mess began after the nationalization of Mauritania's fishing industry. According to the law of the genre, a large turnover of money and lawlessness did their job. At that time, nothing was impossible for a businessman with money in Nouadhibou. It was also easy to circumvent environmental regulations. Today, the city of Nouadhibou is one of the poorest places in the world. So many people live right on these ghostly beaches and inside rusting trading barges and ships. Bolivia's train graveyard has today become one of the country's major tourist attractions. This antique cemetery is located 3 kilometers from the city of Uyuni and is connected to it by old railway tracks, which now lead only in one direction. Dozens of rusty monsters are abandoned here, never to be able to move again. This branch, forgotten in the 1950s, has become irrelevant for the development of business and industry over time. In the past, the city of Uyuni was a distribution center for trains transporting minerals to the Pacific ports. Train lines were built in the late 19th century by British engineers for mining companies, but the local mining industry collapsed in the 1940s due to resource depletion. In addition to this, after the war with Peru and Chile, Bolivia lost its own access to the sea and many trains were abandoned, thus forming a huge cemetery. Today, due to the popularity of this place among tourists, the country's authorities decided not to dispose of the huge rusty mechanisms, but to organize an open-air museum of technology. On the outskirts of Kabul in Afghanistan in the Panjshir Gorge there is a huge cemetery of Soviet equipment that has remained here since the 1980s. Hundreds of armored vehicles with open hatches and engine compartments randomly placed in the open air are a very depressing and instructive sight. The USSR left these weapons to the government army of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan 40 years ago. Afghanistan has virtually no recycling plants, so this tank graveyard has been left untouched, with some of the best preserved fighting vehicles given a second life, sent for repairs and then used again. Ship Cemetery in the city of Minac. Minac is a city in western Uzbekistan, and in the 70s of the last century it was a busy city with a well-developed fishing industry. It was the only port city of Uzbekistan, but the fate of this place is sad, and today Minac is just a shadow of its former glory, already located tens of kilometers from the rapidly receding coastline of the Aral Sea. It was because of human intervention in natural processes, the construction of dams and the construction of canals taking water from rivers that the Aral Sea rapidly drained. The consequence of this was the ruin of fisheries, and the population began to decrease sharply. People who had lost their livelihood began to leave these places, and today only a few thousand people remain in this territory. And in the sand traps everywhere you can see the silhouettes of ships and fishing boats, reminiscent of their frames' steel skeletons about the vulnerability of nature to human ambitions. And indeed, everyone who sees ships sticking out of the sand in the middle of the desert, 150 kilometers from the coastline, wonders how these giants, doomed to eternal rest, ended up here. It's hard to believe that they are standing in a place where sea waves splashed just recently, and they will never go out to sea again, and the sea will not return there until the next global flood. Airplane Cemetery in the USA in the Mojave Desert. This area, filled with neat rows of various aircraft, is located near the Mojave Airport of the same name, 100 kilometers from Los Angeles. The desolate desert area is the perfect outdoor storage facility, with record low rainfall and high temperatures for much of the year, ideal conditions to keep aircraft and their remains from rusting. This aircraft cemetery stores both fully operational mothballed aircraft and spare parts donors, which can be used again if necessary. Equipment began to be brought here in 1970, and since then the territory of this aircraft cemetery has grown to incredible proportions. The planes located here belong to more than 100 airlines, and many of them have long since ceased to exist. Subway cars at the bottom of the ocean. At first glance, it seems that dumping railroad cars into the ocean is an act of environmental pollution. However, it's quite the opposite. Some old New York City subway cars are making their final journey to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. After the used cars are decommissioned, all possible parts are removed from them, and the frames are transported on a barge and sent into the water to create an artificial reef. About 95% of the seabed along the U.S. Atlantic coast is covered with bare sand. The carriages are overgrown with plants and polyps, becoming an excellent habitat for schools of fish that can feed on mussels, shrimp and crabs that live in the reefs. The first old subway cars were dumped into the ocean in 1959. Today there are more than 5,000 of them. Research shows that over several decades, the population of marine flora and fauna on that section of the seabed has increased 400 times. Before being dumped into the ocean waters, old carriages undergo special treatment. First, the paint is removed from them and then treated with steam. Well, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. If it was interesting, support the video with likes. Thank you for subscribing, and take a look at what else we have prepared for you.